Hello everyone, Dr. Feist here again, along with my assistant Bruce Lee, and we're here to continue talking to you about Aristotle and his work, Nicomachean Ethics. And in this video, I'm still in book 1, and I'm going to go and talk about chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 is a little bit on methodology. Chapter 4 is the introduction of what Aristotle calls the best good. And that will turn out to be eudaimonia. What's that? Well, we'll have to wait and see. So in this chapter, that is, now I'm talking about chapter 3. So in chapter 3, Aristotle, he takes a short break from his investigation. He's already talked a little bit about what people think about ethics, what ethics is kind of about. We've seen that. We've seen him talk about that it eventually merges in, connects up with the master art, namely that of politics. So he takes a short break from that investigation. And now he looks a little bit at methodology, and he makes a couple important points that I think are ones that we should always keep in mind as we read this book. I'm trying to present Aristotle as I think he is, not terribly dogmatic and always aware of the limitations of analysis and knowledge. And in this little section on methodology, he makes an important point about the nature of analyzing and thinking about different subjects and domains. More precisely, he talks about rigor. So the idea of rigor in an investigation. So what does he mean? Well, he says that for a good investigation into a subject matter, you want to be rigorous. Of course, you always want to be rigorous. But the term rigor or rigorous doesn't always mean the same thing in every investigation that you make. So, while we want to be rigorous in each case, we may have to vary what we think rigor is in terms of what we're examining. So he says for a good investigation into a subject matter or an area, the rigor of the analysis can only be as rigorous as the nature of the subject matter will allow. So there has to be a match. The level of the rigor of the analysis and the level of the rigor possible in the area that or subject that you're analyzing. That's what makes a good investigation, when the two match. The two, shall we say, rigor has levels. Rigor is not a constant. So that sounds rather abstract. He gives us a couple ways to think about it. So the rigor of the investigative process agrees with the rigor of the subject matter. Clarity, if you like to think of it that way rather than rigor, clarity of the process, so clarity of the investigative process has to match the clarity possible in the subject matter. All right, so that's what we want. This makes for a good investigation. And why is this? Well, Aristotle says it's fundamentally unreasonable if you don't have the correct level of rigor demanded, or if you go overboard, or if it's insufficient. So he says that it's not always reasonable to always demand further rigor or more clarity. Sometimes it can be unreasonable to ask for this. Not all arguments can be equally clear. So sometimes we reach the maximum level. Centuries later, David Hume, the great Scottish thinker, would echo this when he says sometimes it's unreasonable to keep insisting on yet another explanation that goes deeper and deeper, because eventually you're going to start having to make stuff up. If you keep asking why, when a little kid says why, and you keep saying, you keep trying to give an answer, and you keep going and going, eventually things just bottom out. So this is the point Aristotle's making here, is to be careful about the kinds of questions you ask and the kinds of rigor that you demand. He says it is very important to realize that talking about politics, the subject matter is politics, is different than talking about mathematics or physics or the sciences in general. So we have to be aware of that and not demand the same level of rigors in all. He says it's the mark of an educated person. So the educated person is aware of this, that the educated person realizes that, oh, it doesn't make sense. It's not reasonable to demand the same level of rigor from one subject to the next. Anyways, we have to go on a case-by-case basis. So, and Aristotle says that, it gives a rather nice way and succinct way of putting it. He says it's equally foolish. He says it's equally, for Aristotle, it is equally foolish to accept persuasive speech, from a mathematician. It's equally foolish to accept persuasive speech from a mathematician as to demand mathematical rigor in ethics or politics. Why? It just simply is the case that the subject matters of mathematics and ethics and politics, they are different subject matters, and as I pointed out here, they have different levels of rigor. That is the mark of the educated person, to know that. So now, when we go through this book, you may disagree with this, and that's fine, but keep in mind that this is running in the background of Aristotle's thought. You cannot demand this. That is, you cannot demand that he's going to give you an explanation of ethics and politics that looks like what a mathematician would say. So, now Aristotle also points out, he makes another digression in terms of methodology. As I mentioned, an educated person is aware of the clarity overlap, or the mapping of clarity. But he makes another point. He says that a person, when they're making judgments, and he's very aware of the connection between education and judgment. So he says a person, say, I'll just indicate by S, a person S makes good judgments in area or subject matter X when S is educated in X. Now think about that. That has a lot of ramifications when you think about it in depth, that would pertain to politics, the arts, all kinds of things, science. Well, when you want good judgments made about medicine, you go to somebody trained in it. When you want good judgments made about horses, you go to someone who's trained to work with horses. If you want good judgments made about any kind of area, you look for a person educated in it. So, for Aristotle, if you're not well educated in a subject, if not well educated in an area or subject matter, then you're not going to be someone who can make good judgments about it. So you could be an expert in one area. For instance, a doctor who knows a lot about medicine, you're an expert in that area, but that doesn't mean you're going to be an expert about automobiles or horses or politics. So these areas that people are trained in are the areas that they can make judgments in. Now, so to be a good judge is, for Aristotle, is you're trained in something. So to be a good judge in general, To be a good judge in general means you have to have a broad-based education. You have to be well-educated, well-cultured in a variety of areas. So Aristotle was well aware of the problems of when people start making judgments in areas that they're not well trained in. So we've had numerous problems, Aristotle says, with people that are not trained in areas making the judgments in those. Now, you need education, you need knowledge, but there's other things you need to be a good judge in general. So yes, you need all kinds of knowledge. And Aristotle agreed with Plato on that. But Aristotle adds a little bit more to this question of being a good judge in general. Because we're really ultimately talking about ethics and, as we've seen, ultimately talking about politics. So judging is really in the arena of ethics and ultimately politics. So judging in a wide variety of areas. So what does he think that you need in addition to knowledge? You also need So you need knowledge, you bet, but you also need time and maturity. So, to be a good judge in general, to talk about politics, to talk about a variety of issues, to, shall we say today, as we would say today, to get the big picture, which is what essentially Aristotle thinks politics is. Remember, everything sort of fits into the ends of politics, all these clusters and hierarchies, as I spoke about on a previous video. If you haven't watched that, go back and have a look. In order to be able to handle all this, you not only need knowledge, you need time and maturity. Now, what does he mean by time and maturity? When Aristotle talks about time and maturity, basically, he's saying a very simple thing. You need to have a number of years living. You need life experience, nothing more than that. That's, at least in this context of time. You need to be on the planet for a while to have some experience living. Maturity doesn't talk a lot about this, but this is sort of, shall we say, a kind of patience. That we'll get later. We'll look at this more when we talk about virtues, but the ability to calmly reason one's way around. It's going to be linked to reason. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So, older people, Aristotle said, they may have the required experience, they may have the number of years living, but they may not necessarily have the maturity. A young person may have a sense of maturity, although, as I'm going to say in a minute, Aristotle really limits that, but they certainly don't have the number of years living. So, in this way, Aristotle is a lot like Plato. And as I've mentioned, Aristotle studied with Plato for years, and one of the things that Plato says is, if you're under 30, no philosophy for you. Nope, you're too young. Why does he say that? Well, if you look in a variety of places, notably the Republic, Plato thinks that young people really shouldn't be taught philosophy because you're going to end up getting good at arguments and logic. But it's kind of like, and he doesn't use this metaphor, obviously, but it's kind of like putting dynamite in the hands of children. It's too powerful. They don't know what to do. And if you teach young people how to really argue, what do? They end up ripping each other up over arguments, rather than looking at what reason's really supposed to do. Namely, it's supposed to help us work together to find solutions and to find truth. Reason and argument and knowledge and all these things, they're not weapons to tear each other down. Instead, you should think of them more as building materials by which we build each other up. True dialogue, true conversation is not me trying to destroy your argument and you destroying mine. No, the clear import, the value of philosophy, the value of all this logic is that we work together to find the truth. But when you're too young, you're just more interested in trashing everybody's argument and putting forth your own. Aristotle echoes this. Aristotle thinks in some ways the one who may lose an argument actually gains the most because you win some new knowledge. If you just win an argument and you convince someone, yeah, it might be an ego boost, but you haven't really learned anything. So Aristotle is sympathetic to this line, that young people under 30. He doesn't really say it, but the young people then, so the youth, what's the real thing with youth? Well, you got to give them time to grow up. You got to give them more years of experience, and the youth really don't live by reason. That's the main thing. So the youth don't really use reason to govern. They're more living more by emotion. Now, let's not get Aristotle wrong here. He doesn't think there's anything wrong with emotions. Aristotle by no means is telling us to suppress all our emotions and live solely by reason. He's not saying that. He's saying that you have to live by reason, you need your emotions, there has to be a kind of balance, but ultimately reason has to run the show. So when you think about this, about Aristotle and his views, and let's take just a moment here and contrast them with what Aristotle might say about how we view certain things in politics today. So, what I want to just mention here is the notion of young people, the youth voting. Think about what we do today. So, just a little digression. Think about what we say about voting. Well, certainly here in Canada, 18. That's the age of voting. So, think about what we've done as a society and what Aristotle might think. At 18 years of age, what are you allowed to do? You are allowed to vote in any election, provided you're voting in the proper constituency. But let's just put all that aside. You are technically at 18, if you're a Canadian citizen, everything's a go. Vote. Now, think about what that means. In voting, here in Canada, that is an enormous amount of power. Right? That would have startled Aristotle. We say, once you hit 18, you have the power to vote. And what does that mean? Well, that power to vote basically is not necessarily to dictate anything, but it's certainly a big power of influence. Once you can vote, you can start influencing what kinds of governments are set up. And then what kinds of governments are set up are supposed to, in some ways, however they do it, whether they do it rightly or wrongly or are good or bad. But the whole idea, at least in theory, is that once you vote, you have power to influence. And in this sense, the influence is in a variety of ways. What kinds of things our society is going to look like. So people of 18 years of age have an influence in the decisions that are made in the master arts of politics. The master art, that is, of politics. So, for example, at 18 years of age, you're able to influence a government or potential government that will make decisions about war. That's an enormous amount. That would have, I have no doubt that would have shocked Aristotle. That if he would said there will be a future society that will be run and people as young as 18 will be voting on whether or not that society goes to war. He would have found that astounding and maybe pretty shocking and maybe frightening. So perhaps he would have been comforted by the fact that most young people do not even exercise that power, let alone abuse it in any way. So there's a good example of how Aristotle would have been quite surprised at what we've done and what we think. So the question is, for us to think about is, to go back over here, what do we mean by maturity, reason, and youth? Aristotle clearly has his ideas, and he thinks, that at least Aristotle did recognize different stages in life's way. He recognized the notion of childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, but he definitely thought that people that were too young, they don't really live by reason. They're not reasonable enough, echoing basically what Plato said. And so it's not a good idea to have really young people having this much power in terms of having a voting or an influence on governments. So, again, as I said, he would be quite shocked. But I just want to wrap this little discussion up of his methodology by, again, remember, clarity is important, But clarity differs in different investigations. You have to have an understanding of the nature of the subject matter that you're investigating, at least to the point of having an idea of what it's reasonable to demand. And it's not reasonable to demand absolute clarity in ethics and politics the way you would expect it from a mathematician. And likewise, you wouldn't accept from a mathematician kind of hand-waving or rough generalization types of arguments. The last little bit that Aristotle says in chapter 3 is another point, which came up earlier. Anybody who lives by emotions and passions. As I said, Aristotle doesn't want to get rid of the emotions and the passions. He thinks they're important. They're part of what we are. They're part of our pleasures. And we'll see later on that arete has an important component that is of reason, components, that is of reason and passion, and how they have to be put together. So Aristotle is not saying that arete, again, virtue, is devoid of passion. He's not saying that at all. It's important. But anybody who lives by their passions and emotions, for them knowledge is really no benefit. So that's an important point that Aristotle makes about knowledge. Knowledge, then, is of no benefit to those who solely live by their passions. You can teach these kinds of people, Aristotle says, all kinds of things. But if the passions are sort of the governing aspects of the personality, then forget it. The knowledge is really going to be of no benefit. The knowledge, according to Aristotle, benefits the person of reason. And again, the person of reason is not someone like the character like a Mr. Spock who only just lives by logic and has tried to make himself devoid of all emotions. That is not Aristotle's position. Emotions are great, but they have to be governed by reason. So the person of reason, again, this is Aristotle's person of reason. So this is Aristotle. And if you study more philosophy, the notion of the person of reason actually differs according to certain philosophers. So yes, Aristotle does praise reason. He thinks it should be in control, but not to the point where it eliminates the passions. So the person of reason takes control of the passions and shapes them, puts them into a balance with reason, and that is where knowledge can come in and truly benefit that person. All right, so that's a wrap for chapter 3 of the Nicomachean, of book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. What I'd like to do now is shift over away from the methodology and turn to chapter 4. All right, now we turn to chapter 4. Aristotle says, okay, I've done my little digression on analysis, the clarity stuff. With that out of the way, let's get back to the issue at hand, and we're now going to return to this notion of the best good. What's that all about? Now, Aristotle says, and in this chapter is kind of an investigation, shall we say, of a preliminary investigation, just to look at what people say about this best good. We've seen that there seems to be the case for this best good because our idea, our goals, the telos, or the tele in plural, the tele, form clusters and hierarchies. Again, if you don't remember that, go back to a previous video and check it out. They form clusters and hierarchies, and it's not just clusters and hierarchies of the tele of individual persons, but some of my tele, my goals can fit together with yours, etc., and they can fit together in larger frameworks, and eventually the larger framework of the telos of a society. And the telos of a society, that's politics, and Aristotle is very clear about that is a much more noble goal. The telos of a society, the goal of a society, is a much more noble, a much more elevated, a much more valuable goal than the telos of any individual. All right, so But back to this notion of the best good. So he says that at least with respect to its name, so this best good, at least with respect to the name, what we're going to call it, there's a fair amount of agreement. So with respect to the name, there is agreement. Agreement where? Well, he says if you look in society, between what the Aristotle's term the oi polloi, my terrible Greek pronunciation, but this is the term Aristotle uses. And it's got a variety of translations, and if you look at different translations, you'll see it's sometimes translated as men, sometimes it's translated as people, sometimes gatherings, groups. It's kind of a derogatory term, or it's not definitely flattering. You could think of it as something like when we speak of the masses, the crowd. Well, if we start with them, Aristotle says, yeah, they would agree that the name of this is going to be, and I'll say it in a second, but we've already heard of it, and the refined. So this spectrum between the masses and the refined, if you want the Greek term, I'll just make sure I get the spelling right, the oikarentes. So from the masses to the refined, there's agreement that the term, which we've seen, the name, is going to be our old friend eudaimonia. So this best good, the name is agreed upon. From the masses to the refined, it's going to be eudaimonia. That's our best good. So we agree on that. We agree on the name. The next thing that is agreed upon, there's agreement also that it means basically living well. So you got a name in common, maybe even a synonym or two. So it's living well, acting well. Notice, and this is important for Aristotle, that it's about doing, right? It's not just being. It's about being a certain kind of person, but also doing. So his ethics does emphasize action. All right, so far, when Aristotle does his little bit of sociology at the beginning of chapter 4, the best good, eudaimonia, people all tend to agree on the name of it and that it means living well and acting well. But this agreement only goes so far as for a name and a couple synonyms, and that's about it. Now, Aristotle says after you go further than that and you say, okay, well, that's the name, what does it mean? All kinds of disagreements come up as to what exactly. Namely, now we have to move for a definition. And when you're looking at the definition, now all of a sudden agreement is gone. Agreement goes out the window. With the definition, there are many. And this has been a long-standing problem in philosophy. What's the greatest good? What is the good? Plato struggled with that. Lots of ancient philosophers struggled with that. In many ways, simply put, you could classify much of ancient antiquity, ancient philosophy, as an investigation into what is the good. What is the good both metaphysically, like Plato talked about, and what is the good for human beings like us in terms of the best good that we can have. All right, now I've said repeatedly one thing about eudaimonia, and I'm going to stress it again. As I have stressed, this best good, called eudaimonia, this thing that we're all looking for, is sometimes translated as happiness, sometimes flourishing, well-being, etc., etc. I think that it's always a good idea to resist the temptation to immediately translate these key terms. So keep in mind this is a technical term of Aristotle's. So if you say, oh, eudaimonia, that's happiness, what happens? The first thing that happens in someone who's using the English term, for example, or if you translate it into any modern language, French or German or whatever, I think the same reasoning would apply. If I say to you, oh, eudaimonia means happiness, the word happiness is going to mean a whole pile of things to the modern English-speaking mind. Right? When I hear happiness, I think of all certain kinds of meanings, connotations of that term. Now, if you do that, if you immediately try and translate these technical terms and you put them in ordinary English language terms, or French or whatever, you're going to immediately be thinking of Aristotle as talking along the lines of happiness and all the meanings that come with our modern translation. I don't think that's a good idea. Because, why? Basically because if you do that, then you're going to fight the text in a way. Because as Aristotle's talking, you're going to be, I think, unconsciously resisting what he's saying by trying to impose what you think eudaimonia means because of all those meanings that come from your use of happiness or well-being, because you no doubt have a picture of what that means. So, I suggest, and I've had a lot more success with thinking about these ancient texts, is just leave this term. Just think eudaimonia. And then ask yourself, okay, I'm not going to translate it. I'm going to leave it as an unknown and let Aristotle fill it in. So, Aristotle, you say, okay, you've introduced this new term for the greatest good that we can have. You've called it eudaimonia. You're canvassing your society from the masses up to the refined and the beautiful as to what they think. So I'm going to let Aristotle do the work of filling in the meaning of eudaimonia rather than just letting an English translation do all that work. So that's my suggestion. Keep that in mind because sometimes Aristotle will say things about eudaimonia that don't fit with a translation or of a particular English word. So I'm not saying that you cannot understand eudaimonia except if you're absolutely fluent in Greek. I don't believe that's the case. But what I'm saying is that languages, word for word, they don't map onto each other. So let's let the text, Aristotle's work, fill in rather than the meanings of all this, rather than trying to find a single little word that will cover it all. All right, so now, eudaimonia. What Aristotle says is we're going to fill this out, and now how? So, how to explain this? Where to start? All right. So, Aristotle is going to give us, again, what you might think of as a kind of methodology. All right. So, let's think a little bit about Aristotle and his methodology of trying to explain this. Aristotle says we can have two starting points. All right, so when we're trying to explain something, in this case, eudaimonia, we can have two starting points. And indeed, this is reflected in the nature of this text. The whole project of the Nicomachean Ethics. There's two basic ways he tries to get into this notion of explaining eudaimonia. One, you can talk about it from, shall we say, first principles. All right? This is a very theoretical, very abstract way of talking about it, but you can think of it along the lines of not a complete mathematical proof, but an attempt to come up with a fundamental definition of some more general property of what human beings are, and then work your way down to what's the best good for human beings. So we start off by trying to figure out what is a human being, what is the essence of a human being, and then we try to work our way down, okay, well, if it's given this essence, then this is the kind of best good or eudaimonia for a human being. That's working things out from first principles. That's one method. He's going to look at that later. So we'll put that's later on. That's coming later on, and we'll talk about those in a later video. The other way is a very straightforward way. When you want to know something about things, what do? Well, go and talk to people. Simply put, go and talk to people who are smart. Go and talk to people that know things in this area. So it's probably a good idea, Aristotle says, is to go with the familiar. Rather than trying to work your way down from all these abstract first principles, let's just go with the familiar. Talk to people, see what people think, and again, people that have good knowledge that you think are respectable. Let's look at that. Going with the familiar. Now, at this point, we should think about talking to people who know about eudaimonia and what these intelligent people say. But here's another point, and this gets back to his methodology. In the previous chapter, Aristotle talked about the youth, and he said they live too much by emotion and reason. He makes another comment about learning. So in this book, like Plato in the Republic, that is, Aristotle is very concerned with pedagogy and education. Right? We saw him talk a little bit about, if you want to be able to learn, if you want to have the benefits of knowledge, you must be reasonable. But here's another point that Aristotle makes. In order to go with the familiar, to listen to those that know, you must be habituated. In other words, you have to be someone who is able to listen to others. You must be, and remember earlier when I said that Aristotle thinks that perhaps someone who loses an argument could be the net benefiter because that person ultimately learns something. Aristotle is very big on habits and forming proper habits. We'll see the concept of habit play a large role in the notion of eudaimonia much later, and arete, especially arete is all about ultimately habits. So you have to be habituated, what? Habituated to be able to listen. Now, if you recall from a few videos back, I mentioned the foundations of Aristotle's ethics, and I drew that funny diagram. And I put at the bottom that your parents play a role. So, what does he mean by that? He says very clearly, if you've been habituated in order to listen, this has been really the work done by your parents. This is the work that your parents have made you where you're able, and your teachers, of course, as well. Think about it. You can't sit in a university classroom unless you know how to sit in a desk. You can't sit and read a difficult text in metaphysics and ethics unless you're habituated to do that. You can sit down and you can handle a text that's maybe not all that exciting and hard and difficult and, a little dull, a little dry. But you're habituated. You can handle it. You can do this. You've got the habits set up that you've got what I like to call scholar's patience. You don't need a car chase for something to be interesting. You don't even need it to be exciting to be interesting. You can recognize the distinction between a text that's really, gripping and exciting like a potboiler thing, and a text that might actually be quite dull but extraordinarily informative. So I freely admit that Aristotle is by no means a car chase to read, but he's extremely informative and extremely interesting. So you have to have that ability. And if you're that type, Aristotle says, if you're the type that can listen and go and find out what is the familiar from the people that know, well, Aristotle says the odds are you're going to be the type that can also understand arguments from first principles. So he makes this last little bit as a comment on the type of person that can learn. So the type of person has been trained. Aristotle was big on training. We're going to see that he basically says everything is training. Training up the system. We're just, kids and animals and everything. We need training up in order to do the things that we want to do and to get better at them. So you have to be habituated. If you can go with the familiar and you can listen, then ultimately you will be someone who can do philosophy at this level. And at the end of this chapter, he gives us a nice quote from At the end of this chapter, he gives us a nice quote from Hesiod, who was a thinker that, prior to Aristotle by quite a bit, to say the least. You can Google him if you want to have a look at what Hesiod was about. Aristotle, again, was influenced by many, many thinkers of his time, and this is a little cultural background of Aristotle. So if you look at the Becker numbers, I'll write this out for you. At the end of the chapter, 95b, you'll find it starting at 1095b10. And Aristotle quotes Hesiod, and ends his chapter with a little remark by Hesiod, which I'll read out to you. He says, this one is altogether best, who himself understands all things. So that would be the person who is able to understand both ways. But good in his turn is he who obeys one who speaks well. So good in his turn is the person who obeys and speaks well, who can go with the familiar. That's a good person. Good person is one who can listen and is habituated. Then, a good in his turn is one who can do both, and at least do that. But the next line is a good one. But he who neither himself understands, can't handle first principles, doesn't listen to anyone, take this to heart. If you neither listen nor understand, the person neither listen nor understand, Aristotle, following Hesiod, quite blunt, quite nasty, he says is useless. So that's a key thing for Aristotle. If we want to be doing ethics, we have to have these two sides. Being able to listen to others, what kinds of the practical sides, experience. It develops our maturity. We have to be habituated. Our parents have to have done a good job. I often say to my students, you can think of the Nicomachean Ethics as a kind of finishing school. It's not going to help you unless your parents have done a good job by training you to listen, and then opening up the possibilities that you can understand the more rigorous, again, the appropriate level of rigor for ethics, that you can then grasp the whole picture. But if you can't do either of those, you're pretty useless, according to Aristotle. Okay, so that's a wrap for this video. So Bruce and I thank you for listening. See you next video.